All right, welcome to our video on 3.9. 3.9 is going to wrap up a lot of what we've done throughout Chapter 3. It ties into both surveys and experiments. It's primarily for experiments, but it ties into both, so it's a good way of combining everything that we've done in Chapter 9 or Chapter 3 and what we need going forward. So very much a real-world application of these sections. So first, a reminder, what is inference? So that's using information from a sample to make conclusions about a population. So we take whatever our experiment, our survey, whatever that small group is, and then we use that to say, well, I believe that we can say this about the entire population or whatever it happens to be. So we want to make our big conclusions from our small set of data. And that's really statistics in a nutshell. Scope of inference, we see that's the title of this section. That is, so we think scope, that's how much. Scope is like, what are we looking at? And so scope of inference is how can we apply the results of an experiment. This is essentially looking at the design of our survey or experiment and saying, can we say this? Can we conclude this? And so what I'd like you to think about is this idea of scope of inference means that we get to ask, and you notice that you have two boxes here, two questions at the end of any survey, experiment, anything, any really big stats question, we can ask these two questions. And those two questions are, first, can we do cause and effect? We've talked about this throughout the chapter, that if we want to do cause and effect, we need an experiment. We need an experiment because we're going to do random assignments to get that idea of cause and effect. If there's random assignment, which we know is our first step in any good experiment, if there's random assignment, then we can say this cause, this effect. If not, then we just have a very general statement of like this tends to happen. But when we do random assignment, like with an experiment, we can say, all right, well, this drug causes this reaction in patients with the disease or something like that. It's the cause. It's not just that they tend to, it's that it's the cause. So one thing that we check with any scenario is there random assignment? And if so, then we can say, okay, so this is the cause and the effect. And the second is the population. Can we say this applies to the entire population? And in general, what we're looking for, is this a random selection? Is this a random sample? Or is it just volunteers? If it's just volunteers, then it doesn't apply to everyone, because volunteers are not like the general population. They're different. If there's random selection, and if you want to put in parentheses a random sample, then we can make a conclusion about the entire population. If not, then it's just similar to those in the sample. And so this is a good point to star both of these. These are the two ideas that we most use going forward about Chapter 3, that we want to be able to say, all right, any scenario that presented in Chapters 5, 6, 7, whatever, did we have an experiment with random assignment so that we can say cause and effect? Did we have a random sample, a random selection, so we can say it applies to the entire population? And it's a two-part question. It could be one and not the other. It can be both. So in general, an experiment is going to have cause and effect. In general, a random sample is going to be able to say the entire population. And then sometimes we get both. An experiment that uses a random sample, and we get to say both. And the last thing that we're going to write down is there are a couple ethical considerations. This usually comes up in conversation as we've gone through Chapter 3. Well, can we do an experiment like this? Can we do this? Should we do this? And that's really what ethics are. So I want you to write down 3 basic ideas about ethics that we can always use this to explain our thought process throughout. And one of them is that it's nice to have a third party, an institutional review board. You don't need to memorize that phrase, but know that in general, when someone's designing an experiment, someone else looks at it and say, like, this is something that conforms to our ethical obligations. And what are those ethical obligations in general? We're talking about people must give their informed consent. They must know what they're going to do and give their permission to do it. So what are the risks, and are they willing to accept the risks, if any? And then individual data must be kept confidential or anonymous. So we don't want people's individual identities to be out there because all we need to know is they were part of an experiment. We don't need to know who they are. So these data ethics questions will be really clear when we're asking about them, and we say, okay, do we think this is something that we should do? Is it worth whatever we're going to get out of it? And that's separate. So keep that kind of separate from our scope of inference, which is these two pieces where we can use this to say, these are the important things when we look at any experiment or survey. What can we do with our conclusion?